Bees as a whole are believed to have started to evolve around 180 million years ago, along with the evolution of flowering plants. It's believed that at this time, the world was already full with a variety of wasps, and as those wasps began to see the flowering plants around them begin to diversify and evolve, scientists believe that some of those wasps decided that they were tired of the hunting life cycle. They decided to grow their hairs out, basically become hippies of the wasp world, and some of those wasps decided to gather protein from pollen instead of from the prey around them. And that's kind of where it's believed that bees started off evolutionarily. The biggest difference between bees and wasps is what they feed their young. Now, both bees and wasps mainly feed on nectar as adults, the sugary liquid inside of flowers, basically the energy drink of the insect world. But as they're young and growing forms, both bees and wasps do rely on a large amount of protein to grow their bodies correctly and quickly. And so really the main difference between bees and wasps is what they feed their young. Now, wasps obviously feed their young protein in the form of prey, usually chewed up prey remains. However, bees, of course, feed their young quantities of pollen, which is also very protein rich. And that's what they feed their young to beef them up quickly and effectively. Now, to do so, bees have developed several ways to both find and collect that pollen. And a lot of that actually centers around their branched hairs or scopa, which really cover their entire bodies and is the main reason or the main way you can identify bees from wasps is by looking at their hair. Very generally, if you see a bald or hairless insect, chances are it's not a bee. However, there are some bees that are hairless, which I'll get into in just a bit. But the hairs on bees actually work in several fascinating ways to, again, both help them find and collect pollen. And now, even though most flower petals look quite smooth to our eyes, in fact, if you look at them at a microscopic level, they're not flat at all. In fact, most flowers are covered with microscopic structures on them that as air flows over that petal, those structures serve to give the flower as a whole a negative electrical charge. Now, interestingly enough, as bees fly and travel around their area, their hairs are constantly vibrating and bumping into each other, and that action actually serves to make the bee positively charged. Now, as we all know from Science 101, a negative charge affects a positive charge electrically, and so when a positively charged bee lands on a negatively charged flower, all of the negatively charged pollen in that flower is immediately just zapped and sucked right onto that bee. And so their hairs actually help them attract pollen as they land from flower to flower. Of course, these branched hairs also help them hold onto the pollen. Studies are also finding that hairs can actually help bees locate flowers as well. Now, in a way similar to how if you rub a balloon on your hair and then you pull it away, and you'll notice that some of your hairs will actually statically charge and actually will point in the direction of that balloon when you move it away from your hair. It seems like bee hairs actually do very similar things when they get close to the electrical fields of flowers. And studies are finding that actually bees' hairs will point into the direction of the closest electrical field and or flower. And so bees actually follow the direction that their hairs are pointing, especially in heavily foliaged areas or very dense brush area where it might be difficult to find blooms themselves. And so they can actually follow their hairs from bloom to bloom. Now, some studies are also suggesting that bees can actually read the electromagnetic field around flowers and can actually tell if that flower has had a recent visitor or not, just based on how its electrical field is functioning. And so it seems that bees are very finely in tune with the flowers and the electrical fields around them. And a lot of that is due to the hairs densely covering their bodies. Some of the main attractions that honeybees hold, especially for humans, is their production of honey and wax. Now, honeybees are relatively rare in the insect world because they're one of the very few insects, especially flying insects like bees, that survives the entire winter in temperate areas as a whole colony. Most of our bee and wasp colonies here in North America actually tend to die off in the late fall, early winter, and then they kind of reemerge in the spring as only queens kind of overwinter, usually in leaf litter or other similarly protected areas. Honeybees, on the other hand, they try to survive in as much of a large colony as possible. And interestingly enough, honeybees in the wintertime are physically different than honeybees that are active in the summertime. Winter honeybees tend to have more fat on their bodies, and they have several other adaptations that help them survive the slow and cold winter months. However, because of this adaptation, honeybees are one of the very few insects that stores huge amounts of honey. And that's to get them through the harsh winter months. And so, because of their tendency to overwinter in large colonies, honeybees are really the only insect, especially bee, that hoards huge quantities of food to help them survive the wintertime. And again, this food is mostly in the form of honey, which is basically distilled nectar. Now, nectar in flowers is basically sucrose mixed with water. And sucrose is a complex sugar which consists of some simpler sugars that have been fused together. And so it forms kind of a longish chain of sugars. And that nectar is ingested by honeybees who insert a special enzyme into that nectar. That enzyme is called invertase. And what invertase does is it splits that complex sugar sucrose into its simpler sugar constituents. So it splits that sucrose into glucose and fructose. And now what those simpler sugars do is once they're broken off of that chain, they're able to fit much closer together than those long complex chains could. And so that invertase basically splits that sucrose up, and those simpler sugars can fit much closer together than the nectar solution simply could. Once that invertase has been injected into the nectar, the bee will then regurgitate it up into basically either into a cell, or she will give it to another bee in the hive. And then the next bee's job is to either place that into a comb or approach the honeycomb where that nectar solution is, and they actually start ventilating their wings. They will rapidly beat their wings, and they evaporate all of the excess water out of that solution. And so they do that for a period of time, maybe several days. And once all the excess water has been evaporated out of that solution, those simple sugars fit so closely together that there's actually little or no room for anything else to grow in. And really, that's the main reason why honey has the ability to last for almost forever until it kind of gets into contact with water. And that's because there's basically no room for any bacteria or fungi or any organisms to grow inside that honey. And so once that nectar has had its complex sugars split up, then the excess water has been evaporated, then it becomes the honey that we know and love. Now, there are some native bees that do make honey. I will go into bumblebees, especially in a bit. However, again, the vast majority of our bees, even the ones here in North America that make wax and honey, their colonies don't survive the wintertime in huge numbers. And so they haven't evolved the necessity to store up huge numbers of honey. Bumblebees, again, they will make small honey pots that they'll use, for a rainy day or inclement weather. However, honeybees are really the only bee that we know of that store those huge stores of honey. And of course, they store it in wax cells. And now, a cell, of course, are those round openings in honeycomb. In bee lingo, those small chambers are called cells, and we'll talk more about cells as well when we go into native bees. However, honeybees are able to make huge, copious amounts of beeswax, and it's actually, interestingly enough, secreted out of a gland on the bottom of their abdomen. And so it seems as bees are more comfortable and are especially eating more sugar water, basically in the form of nectar and or honey, they begin secreting wax out of that gland on the bottom of their abdomen. And so after it's secreted a good amount, basically like a little plate begins to stick out at the bottom of their abdomen, they'll scrape that off, they chew it up, and then they're actually able to form that wax into a variety of structures at very specific temperature. The famous hexagonal shape that many honeycombs are made in can only be formed at very specific temperatures inside the beehive. And so year round, there are bees whose only job is to regulate the temperature inside the hive. And so in the wintertime, that involves bees vibrating their bodies very quickly to generate heat, and then other bees kind of clustering around those vibrating bees. And in the wintertime, the colony will take turns as to which bees are vibrating and which ones are merely kind of benefiting from that activity. But also in the summertime, there are bees that attempt to keep the hive cool, just like the bees that evaporate water off of nectar that it has had invertase injected into it. There's a whole host of bees that beat their wings, especially around the entrances of the hive, to ventilate the hive, get air flowing through it, and to keep it at very specific temperatures, again, that bees use to work the wax into usable forms. The queen bee can live for up to 4 years, sometimes even longer, which is ancient for bees. Most bees only live for a season or two, and so honeybee queens have developed the ability to grow much longer than most bees, and so they can survive multiple winters. Of course, bees, like all insects, are cold-blooded, and so once the temperature drops below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, they actually can't physically move their muscles, and so they're forced to, again, huddle together in dense swarms or collections of bees inside of the hive, where they shiver, generate heat, and kind of help each other survive the wintertime. However, once the weather starts to get above 50 degrees or so, that queen will start laying her own eggs inside of the hive and will get the process going, again, to raise about 50,000 bees in the height of the summertime. It's about half that size in the wintertime. The queen bee both decides what eggs to lay, and she's also, in a way, held captive by her own honeybee hive as she gets to laying her eggs. Fascinatingly, all bees and wasps as well, really most of the members inside the huge family of Hymenoptera, which includes bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies, they all exhibit a trait called haplodiploidism. And what that means is that a fertilized egg turns into a female, and an unfertilized egg turns into a male. And now what that means from a bee's perspective is that the queen or any female who's laying an egg can decide the sex of her offspring as she lays her eggs. Now, this is deeply important for honeybees because, of course, females do the vast majority of work, from foraging to housekeeping duties to guarding the nest, and males really don't do much besides one thing: mate. Now let's briefly get into honeybee males, who are really the lazy bones of the bee world. Honeybee males really have one job, and that's to see a queen as she's going on her first or second and really only flight outside of a hive, to mate with her, and then to expire quickly thereafter. Males really don't do any of the jobs at the hive. They don't go out and forage. They don't defend the hive, even though they're larger than females. And they can't even feed themselves most of the time. So usually they're actually fed by female worker bees as they visit the hive, usually at the end of the day. And actually, male bees can't even sting. Actually, their reproductive organs are a modified stinger. So, in actually the same way that a female bee will sting you and her abdomen will detach upon stinging, the same thing happens to male bees as they mate with a queen bee. So, I guess it's a good way to go, but unfortunately, it is a quick and violent death whenever males do mate with a female queen. But males do one thing. About 12 o'clock, or at a set time during the day, all of the males in the hive will leave the hive, and they'll all go to one similar spot. Usually it's a space at the top of a hill, sometimes a tall tree, sometimes a flagpole, but all of the males from all the hives in the area tend to all gather at one similar spot. Again, somewhere where they usually have a wide range of sight in the area, usually at the top of a hill. And it's almost like going to the bar. These males all go to the same area, they all hang out, and all they're doing is looking for ladies. And basically they keep their eyes out, and these males will all gather and keep an eye out for a new virgin female queen who, once she emerges from her egg, or from her cell, she takes a series of flights in the area around her nest to attract any male bees from other hives that will then chase her down. She mates with a series of males, sometimes from a handful to maybe even 100 males during that flight. And she actually stores all of the sperm from those matings inside special sacs that she carries around for the rest of her life. And actually, that is such a fine-tuned adaptation that she's able to lay one egg and then she's able to put one singular sperm from that sac onto that egg as she lays those eggs. And so as she goes about her daily job, once she's a fully fledged queen, she can then choose whether her offspring will be male or female. Now, of course, when the hive is doing extremely well and they seem comfortable, they have a lot of growing young, a lot of food for that young, and a lot of honey as well, the hive will begin to raise more males to kind of keep the life cycle of bees up, which involves splitting and swarming, which I'll get into in just a minute. However, in kind of inclement seasons, and especially towards the end of the year, as the seasons start to wind down into the fall and early winter time, those males start to take up a little bit too much room in the hive. They start to eat a little too much honey, especially more than many of the female workers are comfortable with. And so later in the season, the males are unceremoniously kicked out of the hive, wherein they'll quickly die of exposure in a few days. And so the hive really only keeps those males around when they're needed. Again, in the height of the growing season, later, usually in the spring and summer, when new female queens are emerging and are looking to be fertilized.